I am a filmmaker, former fishing guide, and creator of the Montana Fishing Film Festival. Join us this week as we talk about conservation, storytelling, and whether or not our rivers are being loved to death.
Hello listeners, Mandela here. I'm excited to announce that I've been in the recording studio, working on an album with my good friend, Steve Saroff. We just released our first single, and you can support our music by simply adding this song to your playlist on Spotify or Apple Music. To find our music, search for Didgeridoo River Meditation under the artist name Mandela van Eden.
Hi, this is Greg from Explorer Maps in Missoula, Montana. We're excited to collaborate with the Trail Less Traveled, helping connect people and place through art and storytelling. Please be sure to use promo code Mandela for your discount when visiting explorermaps.com.
Welcome to the Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. This episode was recorded on location in collaboration with Explorer Maps. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
This beautiful spring afternoon, we are floating down the Clark Fork River. I'm not going to give away this fishing spot, but I will say that it's a beautiful sunny spring day. We have some Canada geese just behind us, and the river is coming up, but it's still clear, so it might be some good fishing. And I'm sitting here with a angler, storyteller, filmmaker, father, festival organizer, writer, and photographer. His name is Matt Devlin. He grew up in Maryland, sailing. Matt is the creator of the Montana Fishing Film Festival, and I am honored to be sitting here with him today in his badass boat while he rows us down the river. Thanks for joining me on the Trail Less Traveled.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, where did you grow up, and how was fishing an adventure a part of your childhood?
It's a good question. So I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland. Was sort of raised literally on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay, which is a massive brackish water estuary that if you're not familiar with it, you should check out a map. It's an incredible sort of inland sea almost, where fresh water meets the ocean and kind of mixes. We did a lot of sailing growing up. That was sort of my entree to the outdoors, and I think I resisted it a lot growing up, as kids do, especially kids with a rebellious streak. But later in life, it was a huge waypoint for me, and I sailed competitively in college and taught sailing for a number of years and ended up getting my captain's license at one point, and the reason was because of all the hours I logged teaching sailing. And you know, I think whether I liked it or not, it was so imbued into my DNA that even in Montana, 2,000 some miles from the Chesapeake Bay, I think I still identify as a sailor. I would say my sense of adventure as a youngster was just going out the back door. I grew up in a neighborhood that had a lot of green space, and there were a number of houses that kind of all backed up onto this ravine that was sort of a deep trench that I would spend entire days in just exploring. I remember there was a ice storm probably in, I think, 1994. There's a big blizzard in Maryland, and it blew down a bunch of old growth oak trees in the ravine, and they left behind these little bunkers almost. And one of the fondest memories I have as a kid is just playing in those bunkers, you know, playing survivalist or whatever, or jumping in them and turning them into little forts and little nooks to be in. And the ravine transitioned into a swamp. I remember just checking out the swamp, and, you know, which is kind of a weird place to play as a kid, but it was like oil black muck, and it was sort of brooding and mysterious, and there were like these 2-foot wide snapping turtles that lived in it. And I just remember the sense of wonder that I had for that whole ecosystem with the cattails. And in the summer there were like these bright white, I don't know if they were lotus flowers or some sort of lily pads that would bloom, and that swamp eventually transitioned into kind of a wetlands or a marsh, and then opened up into Weems Creek, which is where we kept our sailboat. So fishing growing up was not a big part of what we did outdoors. You know, we kind of tried to fish, but it just wasn't something that we were really dialed into at the time, I don't think. And it wasn't until I was much older that I kind of caught the fishing bug. But there is sort of an old family story that from a very young age, I would almost freak out every time that we would drive over like a small body of water. As soon as I was old enough to kind of see out of my car seat, and if I saw like a little meandering creek or a babbling brook, I would demand that we stop. And my parents I remember them telling me that growing up, that I had like this deep affinity for moving water, I guess. And something about how you could be on a highway and in this asphalt environment and cross, you know, a little vein of water, and as soon as you get down onto the creek or the river, it's a whole different world, and there's a whole different ecosystem, and the air feels different there, and sometimes it's 15 degrees cooler than it is, you know, 10 feet up on the road. And I was just deeply fascinated by that. And I think when I was introduced to fly fishing, in between kind of that and my discovery of fly fishing, I did a lot of perch fishing. And one of the best places to do that was we just called it Apple Pier, which, I don't know, you have names for everything when you're a kid, but I think it was private property, honestly, but we would just walk down and nobody ever told us not to. And there was this like expansive dock system and 2 crab apple trees, which are sort of a Maryland, Virginia thing. And we would literally pick apples off the tree and eat them, and we would fish for perch right off the docks. And we would catch little grass shrimp or brine in these fine mesh nets, like almost like butterfly nets. And all you had to do was just dip them into certain areas of the shallows, and you would, you know, come up with these little translucent shrimp, and you'd put one on a hook, and pretty much every time you dropped down, we weren't fly fishing, of course, we were bait fishing, but you would pretty much get one, you know, most times that you dropped down if you had the right bait. And that was sort of how I passed a lot of time in my mid-teen years. I was introduced to fly fishing when I was 18 and instantly fell in love with it. I think I kind of had the recipe already instilled, and it just took that one instance of exposure to it. And I had lost my father when I was 16 to cancer, and I was having a tough time, I think, to put it lightly. I wasn't making the best choices. I wasn't doing well. I didn't really have anything in my life that any kind of like healthy way to turn everything off externally and, you know, connect. And that's where fly fishing came in. I was on a family vacation with a good friend that I grew up with, and we were out in Colorado, and they said, hey, you boys are going on a half-day guided trip. And we said, what is a guide? Like, what are you talking about? No idea what fly fishing was. Just, you know, besides seeing a river runs through it, I didn't know a single person in my life that fly fished. But we were introduced and showed the basic cast and mend and just, you know, your day one stuff. And I never looked back. I mean, I was immediately hooked. And right when I got home, I saved up and bought my first fly rod, and I started cutting flies apart and taught myself how to tie, and I never looked back. I've been basically in that industry since then, and I'm 36 now.
Matt, I was wondering if you could potentially spin the boat 360 with your fantastic oars and describe to the listener where we are today and what you see when you look around.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Ready for the spin?
I'm ready for this one.
I see really the whole Missoula Valley. We're just west of town, and it's a unique stretch of river, I think, because we're so close to, you know, in Montana terms, a sizable city. But if you look downstream it, you know, it could be British Columbia, it could be like the middle of nowhere, and we're fortunate to have that. The river's in shape. The Clark Fork's looking good. It's a big, classic, big, brawling Western river.
Beautiful. I'm honored to be here in your drift boat today. Matt has been a guide on the Bitterroot, the Blackfoot, and the Clark Fork River, helping people enjoy these beautiful resources. And we're going to talk a little later about the potential of overloving some of these resources. But before we get into that, Matt, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work as a filmmaker, specifically the Montana Fishing Film Festival.
Sure. So I wear a few different hats, and the festival is kind of separate from my filmmaker hat, although I do all the teasers and the stoke reels and stuff, and I typically have a short piece in it, but it's more become a vehicle to elevate and showcase other filmmakers and other stories from hopefully all walks of life. But it started 9 years ago. Somehow we've been doing it, knocking on a decade now. It started at the old Crystal Theater, which I think anybody that has been in Missoula long enough to remember that place, it was really kind of the end of an era when it closed down. But we were, early 20s, mid 20s kids. We just wanted to show a film that my friend had made about essentially what you can see in Montana fly fishing for 10 days. And the film's called 10 Days. My buddy Bryce McLean made the film, and we knew, it didn't have the production value to get into some of the bigger film festivals or film tours at the time. We shot the film on a Canon 70D from Costco that we returned within, I think, their 14-day policy, which, I feel it's not something I would do anymore, but at that time we were broke. We were like working at the fly shop, guiding a few days, and so it didn't have the production value, but it had a really real connective story, and we knew that people would like the film, but we had no platform for it, so we essentially made our own. And we thought, well, hey, it's like a 16-minute film. That's not long enough, to charge people to come see it in a theater. So we need a lineup. And I tracked down some other films, and it's really that simple. The Montana Fishing Film Festival was born. I think that was 2014. Currently and moving forward, our big prompt and message with the film festival is that it's inclusive, it's approachable, and it's fun, because that's, in my opinion, what fly fishing should be. You know, I think like any scene in outdoor recreation, whitewater rafting, skiing, snowboarding, surfing, climbing's a huge one. You get stuck in the scene, and you can spend years swallowed up by the scene, and you're being told what's cool and what's not cool. You know, it was like 5 years into my guiding career, it was like, you know, I'd be heckled by veteran guides for going trout fishing myself. Like, I was supposed to have no love left for those fish because I spend, you know, over 100 days a year guiding for them. And it's like no, you know, trout's the whole reason, little big blue heron. Trout's the whole reason that we have any of this.
Tell me what you're looking at.
I'm looking at a great blue heron, which there's two things. There's actually three things that jolt me back to my upbringing in Maryland. One of them is seeing herons on the water. One of them is hearing the call, or almost the cry of an osprey, because we have those on the Chesapeake Bay. And then the third one is actually kind of happening right now. It's the sound of water lapping on the bottom of a drift boat. It reminds me of spending weekends on our Catalina 27 family sailboat, which is called Om Shanti.
Jai?
So what we're trying to do is kind of get out of the scene and remind people why they fell in love with the sport of fly fishing in the first place, and bring new people in the sport and show them that it's not this intimidating space. And I feel very strongly that I want to represent, you know, we're always going to have white men represented, because, you know, there's a lot of us, myself included, involved in this sport, but there's lots and lots of lady anglers and female anglers that have been doing it a long time, or not a long time, but they're passionate, and we like to give them a platform in our festival. Half of our films this year feature female anglers, and I also feel strongly about diversity, and we have those elements in our film festival as well. So it's a place for everyone, and you don't have to be a professional expert level fly fisher to enjoy what we're doing. I've been forced to think about this a lot, and really what it boils down to, you know, if I had to distill my message, I guess, it would be that, very simply put, I want more people to experience the healing, therapeutic benefits of fly fishing that I've been fortunate enough to have in my life. And I think fortunate is kind of the operative word there, because the only reason that I was exposed to the sport is through my privilege. You know, having a wealthy friend that invited me on a family trip in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, where their family, you know, owned a ski out condo. And that was why I was introduced to this thing that instantly changed my life. And I want people of color and more women and people from all walks of life to have access to the sport. And all you need to get started is, you know, hopefully a mentor, but you just need a rod and reel, and you can pick one up at Walmart, literally, for under $100. You need a handful of flies. You need one spool of tippet and a pair of toenail clippers. And you can go fishing, and you can catch the bug, so to speak, and you can be involved in the sport with very little entry. You know, I think it's really a misnomer that fly fishing is inherently elitist. It's actually very accessible, and particularly in this state, we have, at least for the time being, we have favorable stream access laws, which allow you to fish hundreds, thousands of miles of public water.
Fantastic. You have extensive work as a filmmaker and storyteller. Can you tell us a little bit about why you've chosen filmmaking as your platform to share stories, and why it's important in this day and age to listen to each other and to share stories?
I always wanted to be a writer, and I identified as a writer most of my life. You know, I started writing poetry in like first and second grade, and went to college for creative writing, and that was always my thing. And then at some point, you know, predating the film festival, I had a friend in Maryland named Jason DuPont who was making kind of like low budget, you know, films about fly fishing, and I ended up holding the camera a bunch and just sort of got involved. And my friend Bryce was making films, and I, you know, inevitably ended up holding the camera and just sort of, I just kind of picked up a few things through osmosis, I guess. And then for the film festival, I literally needed more content. And so I got, you know, the nicest camera I could afford, which wasn't all that nice, and taught myself. But I think that the connection between writing and filmmaking is certainly storytelling. And I think that crosses genres. And what I'm interested in from a professional standpoint is telling stories about people that are connected to the outdoors, mostly for outdoor brands. And I've been fortunate enough to work on projects that are really important to me, and to have total creative control and be big enough to get the job done, but small enough where I am not part of a massive team where you sort of lose that intimate connection to the whole piece. And filmmaking is incredibly intimate. You know, when you interview someone, you know, especially about sensitive, tender things, you're asking them to show themselves to the camera. And I think that, you know, it's almost a therapy session. You have to sort of like know when to push and know when to listen. And there's times where I've had to hold things out of films because it was too much. And that balance is kind of, I think, really at the heart of storytelling in the digital filmmaking form.
That is the voice of Matt Devlin. He is a filmmaker, storyteller, and fisherman. We're on the Clark Fork River. We just floated past a beautiful lineup of healthy ponderosa pines. And in the distance, I thought I did see a pair of eagles. In a moment, we're going to eddy out. But before we do that, I was wondering if we could dive into conservation a little bit here. Matt, what is the most pressing conservation issue that you've experienced firsthand as an angler?
That is a tough one. I think the most pressing issue is climate change. I think that we're looking at losing a staggering amount of trout habitat in the next 20 years. We're sitting on a river that should probably be blown out by now, or almost blown out. And, you know, our runoff events have completely shifted. When I started guiding, like maybe 14 years or so ago, you know, July 3rd, July 5th or so is when we could start guiding again on the Bitterroot. And now we're, you know, running trips through June, and our shoulder seasons are getting longer and longer, and our hoot owl restrictions are getting earlier and earlier. And I don't think a lot of people seem to care. I think that they just, like a smoke 'em while you got 'em situation, and that's really dangerous. And we're just accepting these new normals. And I think that, A, you need to get on board with climate change, and B, you need to start thinking about things you can do. I think one really simple thing is if you're a guide or a longtime river user, just eliminate plastic bottles from your daily routine and just go to reusable bottles. You can have a big jug, metal jug, and some smaller canteens for your clients or your friends or your family. And that little thing, you're talking one guide season, you could probably fill a garage with empty plastic bottles. And I know in some ways it's easier, but that's one thing. Because I think a lot of people ask, well, what can I actually do? That's one thing. But I think that one of the scariest threats to trout habitat and trout fishing in Montana and in the world is mining, and it's complicated, but it keeps me up at night thinking about the mine in the headwaters of the Smith River. And mines pretty much always fail in some way or another at some point. It doesn't matter what you do, it finds a way, and we live close to a long and sordid history of mining in this state. We're on the Clark Fork River. We're downstream of the Berkeley pit. It's like a sleeping giant that it will never be there. And if anything ever happens, it's going to be really, really bad. And that's the whole West. And we do need certain things from mines, but we need more and more restrictions, not less.
Matt, what gives you hope regarding these issues?
I think that a lot of people do care, and I think that it's impossible to be a fly angler and not involved, at least theoretically, in conservation, because we need cold, clean water. And it's as simple as that. If you love catching trout, you need pristine environments to catch them in. And so we're at a time where the sport is growing faster than it ever has. It gives me hope that there's more and more people finding the sport, and that means more and more people that will eventually find their way to conservation. And there's a lot of folks doing good, hard work in the conservation space.
Earlier, Matt and I were talking about how awesome steelhead were. I was relating it to what I feel to be one of the more explorative species out there, exploring the rivers and the ocean. And Matt mentioned that he wanted his son to experience a steelhead, and that hopefully your son can experience, that fish. But tell me a little bit about the importance of sharing angling and the beauty of a species such as the steelhead with your son.
I think it's pretty simple. When you have a child, that's a little person in your life that you love, and you want to share things with them that you love. And you want those things to be there so that you can have rich, fulfilling experiences together. And steelhead, for instance, are a fish that lives an incredible life in a saltwater ocean environment, and then running back into small coastal streams or interior streams if they're Columbia summer run fish. And they spawn and create the next generation in the rivers that they were spawned in. And they can return to the ocean and they can come do it again. And they're they're fascinating, and they're beautiful, and they're kind of mysterious, and they're hard to catch, and they fight incredibly hard, and they are literally on the brink of extinction. And that's scary. And I think for a lot of years it was sort of like, yeah, things are getting bad here, but you can just go up to BC and you can kind of go experience steelheading as it should be, you know, as it used to be 20 years ago in the lower 48. And, you know, the Skeena River system, the most important artery for steelhead in BC, is experiencing years of the worst returns they've ever had. And so people need to wake up, and fish are resilient as hell. I mean, that's one thing that we know to be true. I mean, look at what conservation groups have done on the Upper Clark Fork and on the Blackfoot, the big Blackfoot chapter of TU and the Blackfoot Challenge. I was fortunate enough to interview Paul Roos a number of years ago. Actually, one of the first films I ever made that had a budget was called Keep Our Blackfoot. And he was sort of the godfather of that conservation effort on the Blackfoot. And it went from an incredibly marginal fishery to a world-class fishery that is so healthy and so vibrant directly because of conservation efforts and stream rehab and partnerships with landowners and ranchers and things that you don't see when you drive up Highway 200 to put your raft in. And it's a story that, you know, has played out in a lot of places, and it might not be too late for that story to play out for steelhead, but we need change now. We need like outside of the box change. We need, you know, rotating river closures on the Oregon and Washington coast where you close systems for years. And, you know, I could talk all day about that, but it boils down to wanting to experience things that have been life-altering or life-enriching with your loved ones. And for me, that's my 5-year-old son, Noah.
That is the voice of Matt Devlin. We just eddied out here on River Right. A couple things come to mind. You know, it's springtime. On the top of this eddy, there is a downed tree. For those listening, just keep an eye on what's going on downstream as you get onto the rivers as they get higher.
That's a scary one.
Yeah, that's a scary strainer.
That's like you can... Wood is what gets you in trouble in where we live in Montana. It's not, you know, whitewater's scary and loud, but a lot of times it'll spit you out, but wood doesn't. And we're looking at just a classic cottonwood stringer that, you know, if you get too close to it, it can be too late in a matter of, you know, one missed oar stroke. And, you know, the one thing, when I taught sailing, we would say tiller towards trouble. And that means, you know, push the tiller towards the obstruction or the trouble, and the boat goes the opposite way, because that's the way a tiller and a rudder works. But with floating rivers, you know, you want to put the bow towards trouble and always back row. Like, if I don't know if I'm supposed to give a tip, but if there's a tip, that's the tip is back row away from scary stuff, because as soon as you start panicking and pushing away from something, every forward stroke, you're going faster and faster downstream, and you're not in control anymore.
Hear, hear. Matt spent many years guiding on the Clark Fork, the Blackfoot, and the Bitterroot, and many people don't realize that a lot of drowning incidents happen on the Bitterroot because of all the strainers on that river. So I also wanted to point out that we went by a great blue heron, and there's some amazing things happening right now with the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Every state has a list of what they consider species of greatest conservation need, and the great blue heron is actually on that list. And so we've been highlighting a lot of the benefits of Recovering America's Wildlife Act for hunters and anglers. For example, when habitat is improved for great blue heron, it can improve habitat for many other game and non-game species.
Even in my guiding career, in the beginning, we used to get really excited about bald eagles, and we'd point them out, and everybody from out of state would kind of make a big to-do about it, and they'd pull out their cell phone to take, the grainy photo, zoomed all the way in. And then I started noticing that people were getting less and less excited about bald eagles, and it's because they were being recovered slowly in other parts of the country. And that's a real thing that's happening. There's more and more healthy populations of bald eagles. And so it's and we're talking a short, decade and a half of time on the water. You see something go from an anomaly to sort of commonplace in all of these other parts of the country. And that is just an interesting thing to see. It's like seeing it in real time.
I don't know about you, but that gives me hope.
Same.
Well, I'm going to let Matt put his waders on. He's getting ready to get out and hopefully interact with a fish.
Hello, this is Greg Robitaille from Explore Maps in Missoula, Montana. For as long as I can remember, I have been amazed at how my brother Chris turns his creative thoughts into the most incredible art imaginable. When we were young kids growing up in Toronto, one day our mom said, "Chris, please go take a nap." But as fate would have it, I think he heard Mom say, "Chris, go make a map." And thus, I like to think that's when Explore Maps was born. Many years later, we have now rendered more than 60 hand-drawn artistic story maps of travel destinations worldwide, all created with the intention of connecting people and place and helping communities raise awareness for the conservation of our public lands and the wildlife and distinct cultures that inhabit these amazing areas. So come along and join Chris and I on this educational and inspirational journey, using hand-drawn maps as the vessel to help tell these unique stories. Please be sure to use promo code Mandela for your discount when visiting exploremaps.com.
Today, the Trail Less Traveled is being recorded in the chilly water of the Clark Fork in the spring. I'm standing in an eddy with Matt Devlin, and he is wearing waders. He's fly fishing a very large trout, maybe it actually did make contact.
Oh yeah, no, we hooked and he was on. He just ran into the heavy water and did what big trout do.
Well, I'm just so grateful to be standing here in your natural habitat. Matt was a fly fishing guide for over a decade. He is a filmmaker. He started the Montana Fishing Film Fest, and he also recently had a conversation with Norm Maclean's son. So I wanted to talk to you right now about how amazing it is to have these resources, but it's super important to get engaged and do what you can to protect them. When we first started talking, you actually mentioned to me that we might be overloving the Blackfoot. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. Looks like you're changing your flyover, and just talk to you about your conversation with Norm Maclean's son. Maybe someone's listening who doesn't actually know who Norm Maclean is internationally, so maybe you can also explain that.
Sure. So Norm Maclean's son is a man in his 70s named John Maclean. And Norman Maclean, of course, is the author of A River Runs Through It, one of the cornerstones of the literary experience in the West, and also the lifestyle in the West now. So many kids growing up, their first exposure to fly fishing was through the film that Robert Redford produced. I'm not sure if he directed it, but the story goes that Jim Harrison, who's one of my all-time favorite authors and a Michigander that chose to live his days out in Livingston, Montana, he put a copy of A River Runs Through It into Robert Redford's hands, and that's the way the story goes. That's how he became aware of the book and wanted to tell that story about the McLean family and about fly fishing and about Missoula, Montana. His son, John McLean, himself is a writer, a good writer, and he was a newspaper man, to use his words, a journalist for many years, and I was able to interview him about a book that he had coming out, and we showed it in last year's Montana Fishing Film Festival. But one of the topics that came up is the state of the Blackfoot River. That was a fish. Woo! We conducted the interview. That was like right when it hit the water.
Yeah.
Wow. We conducted the interview in Seeley Lake, Montana, miles from the McLean family cabin, which was really cool. He wouldn't even let me take a picture of it. It's really kind of hallowed ground, I think, in their family. And we were sitting under like a 1,000-year-old tamarack, I believe, named Gus. And there's a little observation deck around it and stuff. But of course, the film was based on the Big Blackfoot River, which is kind of right in that general area off Highway 200. And John essentially, said, kind of volunteered that something he struggles with is the impact that there's two sides to it. There was extremely positive impact that the film A River Runs Through It had, which was, a Hollywood success. It was a success as a movie, kind of in all the ways that a movie can be. And that kind of spurred a massive conservation effort on the Blackfoot River, because it had fallen on really hard times when the movie came out. It was essentially guides in the area were driving all the way over to the Missouri to fish, because there wasn't really a sustainable population of fish in the Blackfoot. There were a few fish here and there, but the effects of mining and logging, overgrazing, kind of all that stuff had really affected the river system, and the movie influenced the cleanup efforts and the conservation efforts. But on the flip side, it's become such a good place to fish, and it's such a beautiful valley. If you've ever floated through the Box Canyon, you get it. And John McLean kind of volunteered that the river might be experiencing sort of being loved to death, I guess. And he shared that he had gone to kind of a favorite spot to try to fish the evening hatch, I think the night before, and that he was just blown away by the amount of traffic and just, recreational anglers, lots of guide trips coming in, leaving. And he said he just kind of 20 minutes into it just called it quits, and that's kind of sad, if the guy who's sort of, he wouldn't want this, but he's sort of like royalty in that valley, I guess. You feel like he should be able to find a quiet spot to reflect on life and sit on a rock and watch the river and maybe catch one. But he wonders, as a lot of us do, if the river's being loved to death, and if it's just being overfished, to the point of the experience changing dramatically. You catch fish in the upper river, mostly cutthroat trout, which are sort of a fish that evolved in really sterile river systems, so that they basically, compared to other fish, they're essentially easy to catch, because they evolved in places without a lot of food. And so they eat a lot of flies, and they have kind of soft mandibles. And I would say most of the cutthroat you catch in the upper river have got, massive hooking injuries, and a lot of them survive, but it's kind of, I don't know, it just hurts a little bit. It's kind of sad to see. It's like, it really reminds you of what's going on, and it's sort of, these fish are just being kind of caught over and over again, and there's so much pressure, and we don't really have the answers. I think some people suggest maybe more regulations as far as the commercial traffic on the river, but you can have too much of a good thing, I think.
That's the voice of Matt Devlin. He's standing here next to me in the river fishing on the Clark Fork River today, where we are recording the Trail Less Traveled. Matt worked for over a decade as a fly fishing guide, and he's also a filmmaker and the head of the Montana Fishing Film Fest. And we are both staring at his fly. He did get 2 bites, I think, while we were out here. My feet are going numb because I'm not wearing waders, but that's just what happens when you record the Trail Less Traveled on location in someone's natural habitat. And we are right now in Matt's natural habitat. So Matt, before we end the show, I wanted to talk to you about the Montana Fishing Film Fest.
Sure. We've got our biggest, that was a fish. They're fun, they're inclusive, they're diverse, they're approachable.
Beautiful, Matt. I just want to say thank you for your time and energy joining me here today on the river / the Trail Less Traveled.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Let's end your show with 3 bits of advice.
3 bits of advice. I didn't really think about this. I better get my ducks in a row. Advice about life?
Well, I mean, honestly, start with what you're using right now, because you've had 2 or 3 bites already.
Well, some of that's top secret. Yeah. But, I think advice as far as life is, if there's something that you really want to do, nobody's going to hand it to you. There's a few, I say lucky people, but I wouldn't want to be someone that didn't have to work for what I had at the end of the day. And I think if you believe in something hard enough, throw yourself into it, be prepared to fail, do the hard work, and most likely 5 or 10 years later, you'll look back and maybe you'll reflect for a moment and see how far you've come. Also, I think when it comes to fly fishing, don't be intimidated. You're not going to be an expert in a day, but you can never learn to fly fish if you don't start.
Namaste, Missoula. Mandela here, your host of the Trail Less Traveled, the Trail 1033's locally harvested adventure radio series, which premieres every Sunday night from 6 to 7 Mountain Time. You can stream the show live online at trail1033.com. And remember, if you missed the premiere, it's also a podcast, available everywhere. You can follow the adventure as it unfolds by visiting the official website, which hosts the full show archive of over 600 episodes, by visiting traillesstravel.net. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank a small family business based in Missoula, Montana, with roots in Africa, Explore Maps. Explore Maps and the Trail Less Traveled have teamed up to connect people and place through their story maps, art, history, culture, conservation, and community outreach. You can learn more by visiting exploremaps.com. For many years, people have been asking me to produce some didgeridoo music, and I wanted to share with you that my friend Steve Saroff and I have released a single on Spotify and Apple Music. You can support our music by simply adding this song to your playlist. In order to find it, search for Didgeridoo River Meditation under the artist name Mandela van Eden. That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, living in Missoula with access to public lands and waters is certainly a privilege. And with privilege comes responsibility. Please get informed, get engaged, and speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. Like we say in Africa, if you think you're too small to make a difference, then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.